Herniated discs in your lower back are the most common cause of back pain and sciatica suffered by many every single day. And whether it's a minor bulge at L4, L5's disc, or a more severe herniation at L5, S1, doing the right things is going to make a massive difference to your recovery. And in today's video, we're going to help you understand the right pathway forwards to save you a tremendous amount of pain and frustration in the process. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Michael Fatika, the lead osteopath and spine specialist here at Back in Shape. We help people around the UK and all over the world fix their back pain from home and get back in shape for the long term. Today, we're going to go through 5 steps that you can take. Understanding what is actually happening when we've got this disc injury, how to stop making it worse, things you need to do to start making it better, and then focusing on stability and rebuilding the strength and stability of these segments in your spine. It should be a really insightful one. And as always, if you've got any questions as we go along, you can post those down in the comments. The first and most important thing is to understand how the discs actually work. And we've got the nucleus, which is the jam or the gel in the middle of the donut. And then we've got the annulus fibrosus around the side here. And the annulus fibrosus is really the thing that's doing the heavy lifting, so to speak. And what this annulus is doing is it's a mesh of a number of layers of ligament that are arranged perpendicular to one another to hold that fluid in the middle. And with that, it provides an ability to absorb shock and create cushioning, but it also separates vertebra 1 from vertebra 2, creating this nice space on the side here for the nerves to come out. Understand also that although this model just shows you the disc, the functioning of the disc blends and is supported and reinforced by the many ligaments that make up the back part of the spine and the front part of the spine. There are naturally many more on the back part than there are on the front, the primary one on the front being the anterior longitudinal ligament. And these ligaments, together with the annular fibers of the disc, create a degree of tension and stiffness in the joint, holding it in place. From this stiff rigidness that all of our joints have, the bones don't just fall apart in any other joint, apart from maybe in very, very, very severe cases of hypermobility disorders where we have connective tissue disorders. The stiffness that these ligaments provide mean that the musculature and our will can direct our spine in different directions and allow those ligaments to give a little bit as we go into different ranges of motion. But make no mistake, the stiffness of these ligaments when they are intact, including those annular fibers of the disc, is what provides stability to the joint or the segment from L5 to S1 or L5 to L4. The easiest way to think about the structure of your spine and this stability is those flexible lights that we can get, often reading lights, where we just pull the end of the light and the thing bends in a uniform way because there is equal stiffness and tension throughout all of the little ball bearings that make up that joint. Now, whether it is a herniated disc like this or it's a bulging disc like this, we have to understand that there is a failure of the ligaments. There is a reason that it is going backwards, and that is because the fibers on the back part of the disc are the ones that have been placed under the most strain. Most of you guys, when you injure your back, it's because we went forwards in one direction or another. Now, granted, other repeat episodes might well involve different directions, but that common one that aggravates all of these herniated and bulging discs is going to put the sock on in the morning or pick something up off the floor over here. It's that forward bending that creates this damage. But it's not only the annulus fibrosus of that disc that will have been damaged in this process. The ligaments that work with that annulus on the back of the spinal junction on these parts here will also have been involved in some way, shape or form. Simply put, in order for us to compress the disc on the front, in order to create significant enough pressure to damage that disc and result in the disc bulge, we have to have been stretching the ligaments that would run between the bones here as well. And therefore, what we are dealing with once we have this bulging or herniated disc is a loss of integrity of the things that stabilize and hold those two vertebrae together. As opposed to more or less every other joint in our body, it is impossible to control L5S1 or L4-5 or any other spinal segment in our spine. And the reason for this is we just don't have cognitive control of that section. You can flex your wrist, you can bend your knuckles, you can do all of these other movements of individual peripheral joints, elbows, knees, wrists, ankles, etc. But you do not have that kind of fine control over your lumbar spine. Cue the analogy we mentioned earlier about that flexi light. All we can do is move it in one direction or another, and we hope that things will move in an appropriate fashion. But when there's an injury there, things don't. It is from this reality of a lack of control over these individual segments of the spine that this second issue arises. And that is the fact that the other sections in your lumbar spine that don't have the significant herniated or bulging disc are still going to be relatively in significantly greater levels of health. Therefore, have significantly greater levels of resting stability and stiffness and tension in those ligaments, including the discs, including the other ligamentous structures that hold that spine in its correct place. The reason this is such a problem is because we can't control movement. And as we'll see later, some of the common exercises that are done involve us moving our spine because you should move it more, right? Wrong. But the point is, all we can do is do this sort of movement. So if all of these ones up here are nice and stiff and appropriately healthy, but this L4-5 segment has a raging herniation, it is a point of instability. It is a weak link in the chain. And therefore, considering the fact that we cannot segmentally move our spine, we can only move its entirety in one way, direction or another. When we do those sorts of movement will preferentially go through the path of least resistance, which is our herniated disc. And just like that example again of the flexi light, you'll see a hinge point creates at the defunct little segment, meaning that a substantially greater movement is going to go through those weakened structures, let alone if this is at speed or with a sustained force. We're going to find that we are constantly going to be targeting that same injured segment, baking in more and more instability as we go on. It's also worth noting that, as you guys can see when I move this spine around, the joints hinge on one another, either hinge forwards, backwards, or twist. And what that looks like is this kind of motion here. Okay, when we are injured in a particular segment, rather than having this hinging, we often find we get a bit of shearing taking place because the disc isn't held or holding the segment in the right sort of position with that appropriate tension. And it allows a bit of this translation forwards, backwards, or quote unquote wobbliness. A great example of those of you that will experience this firsthand is when you do something like a cobra position. And this immediately, for many people, not everybody, but many, as you arch backwards, instead of hinging backwards, particularly at the L5S1, it shears backward, creating immediate sciatic symptoms or back pain down in the lower back. Now, I appreciate that this paints quite a dire picture, but it is so important that we actually understand what is happening when we have a herniated disc so that we can effectively understand how the spine works and make more strategic decisions with regards to getting better. So now we know that there is an instability as a result of the injury. We know that the disc works with many of the other ligamentous structures that provide stability to the spine, and that now that there is a significant step change in tension at one specific injured segment, and that movement is going to preferentially go through there, we can start to evaluate what are going to be the right strategies to move forwards with regards to getting this thing better and allowing it to recover and heal. Before we even think about any exercises, we have to understand that for most of us, the most important thing we can do is stop making the problem worse. And we're in a position with this herniated disc where we can't even trust ourselves to get out of bed in the morning, to walk around in the kitchen, to get dressed without the risk of that herniated disc creating aggravation and catching us out. And this is because of that instability. And many of those movements that we've been doing without a thought, rounding our lower back, twisting our lower back, bending our lower back, are habits that arguably have led to the repetitive strain on this disc that has preceded the actual herniation event itself. And make no mistake, most people with severe herniated and bulging discs did not do them in one instant. It wasn't an instant of significant trauma, such as a car accident or falling off a ladder. For most people, it's been a steady assault, a repetitive strain type injury that has just been a bombardment of that particular area over and over for months and years even. And so an integral part of the recovery process is going to be stamping out some of these bad movement patterns that have constantly been allowing the spine to move in its entirety, which is going to only mean that force is going to focus through that unstable segment. And as we'll discuss later on, as we start working on stability, we are more effectively able to make some of these daily life habit changes to make them more friendly for our spine. The final part of stop making it worse includes avoiding many of the commonly prescribed exercises. And the reason, we won't get into it too much here, but the reason that you guys get recommended these exercises is just a failure to properly understand at the right resolution what it is to have a disc herniation. And too much of those exercises are focused on trying to deal with excess inflammation and trying to deal with muscle spasm in a way that violates the needs of that herniated disc, in the pursuit of short-term relief for a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, at the expense of that medium to long-term recovery. Exercises like knee hugs, child's pose, sciatic flossing, thread the needle. All of these sorts of movements that involve large amplitude, large range of motion movements, forward, backward, twisting one way or another, are all going to be reinforcing the stress and strain on that same old segment because of that disparity in available tension and stability between the injured segment and the surrounding segments. And what that means is when we're doing our child's pose, for example, rather than all of these segments having a nice flexion going through them, we're finding that these other ones higher up are not going to be as readily moving, and this L4-5 is going to be flexing out tremendously, stretching all of those ligaments and tissues that are trying to actually restore stability in their natural position. Not to mention the fact that this is reinforced by the average adult spending about 9.5 hours a day sitting every day, which has further flexed and rounded that lumbar spine to make it more difficult for that herniated disc to recover. And I'll finish this section by just saying you will be amazed at simply the beneficial effect of stopping doing the bad stuff can have on allowing those herniated discs to start to get some recovery under their belt and some momentum. When we stop doing these sorts of exercises, it means that we're not interrupting moment to moment every single day the healing that's trying to take place in these discs. Now, ultimately, a relief strategy is going to be important because the pain for some of you guys is going to be unbearable, but we have to focus on relieving the strain on the herniated disc in a way that doesn't create future problems. And so unlike those stretches that we just mentioned, the child's pose, the knee hugs, and the other bending and twisting movements, these strategies are there to provide relief of strain on the lower back, and I'll explain each one for you guys, without coming at a cost of aggravating the underlying disc. One of the first steps is to relieve the strain on the lower back coming from the hips. For a lot of us with lower back issues, we have referral symptoms and dysfunction into the muscles of the glutes, the muscles of the hamstrings, etc. They are stiff and not working as well. And with correct stretching of those muscles, very simple stuff that everybody can learn to do very quickly, we can provide a 5 to 10% increase in the mobility of the hips, which means that the hips get to move more so the lower back doesn't have to when we're doing those activities of daily living. And simple stretches for the back of the thigh, the front of the hip, and the buttocks region can all be very helpful and very easily accessibly done for us all. And granted, these have limited reward for the time invested. It's going to be short-lived, especially in the early days of the recovery process. But as you make more progress through your strengthening work, which we'll discuss later, you will find that the benefits of this start to compound. Simply doing your hamstring stretch, your hip flexor stretch, or your glute stretch, done for around about 30 seconds on each leg a couple of times a day as part of this routine that we're going through now, will really help just offset some of the strain that's building in that lower back. But please know, if you flare yourself up as you're walking over across the kitchen or around the office, it is going to undermine the progress that you've just made, which is why we place a low level of importance on these sorts of things and why they need to be done not only now in the throes of a severe flare-up, but also for the long term, even as we come out and start making significant progress on our strengthening rehabilitation work. The next little stretch you're going to do is a relieving stretch for the disc specifically and supporting the natural position of the lumbar spine. As you've already guessed it, too much of our daily life is going to be spent in this position, rounding and bending forwards. And using the towel, a small rolled up towel about the size of a foam roller placed underneath the spine here, can provide this decompression. It works in a couple of important ways. Firstly, it's going to create a small stretch or elongation of the spine, opening out the disc spaces. It's also going to take pressure and tension off those ligaments that run between the vertebrae on the back by restoring that natural neutral position. Note, it is not arching the back, but just holding the neutral lordosis. Additionally, it'll take pressure off the muscles in the lumbar spine, taking those muscles off tension rather than stretching them further. And ultimately, this is a very, very gentle stretch that we should all be doing, especially if we're someone who spends a lot of time sitting every day. You can hold this stretch for around about 20 seconds up to 5 minutes. You can do it multiple times a day, and I would always suggest doing it after the stretches that we've just discussed for the legs. And some of you guys might find it a little bit uncomfortable to start with, and there are many reasons for that, and we discussed that in other episodes of the podcast. But altering the duration that we're doing this for, doing it on the bed instead of doing it on the floor, and also using a slightly larger or slightly smaller towel can all be strategies to help deal with the quirks of your specific circumstances and the often high levels of congestion in that lumbar spine. An additional bonus decompression is going to be the bed decompression, which allows us to lie on our tummy and use our arms to pull our torso in this direction, creating this gentle stretching down in the lumbar spine, decompressing those discs and creating this pumping effect by gently pressing our arms into the table to get the pull and then relaxing and also playing around around with deep breathing. We discussed this in full detail in a tutorial videos or in many tutorial videos that can be found down in the description. When we've got a disc injury, we've always got a degree of stenosis by definition, and this can sometimes freak people out, but all it means is a narrowing of the space available. And if you look at this disc herniation or disc bulge here, you can see that it is occupying the space where the nerves come out, meaning that there is a lack of space. And on top of that, because it's injured tissue, there's going to be a lot of inflammatory products here. Make no mistake, inflammation is a good process. It's the process by which we divert the immune system and raw materials to an area to help it undergo a healing process. But in the lumbar spine and any other areas of the spine, because of the nature of the confined space, the fact that these bony canals are not very stretchy, uncontrolled inflammation often leads to the pressure on those nerves, and that will be the source of the pain for most of you beyond that initial flare-up. And what I mean by that is that you did the instance, you bulged the disc, you made a little tear in some of these fibers as the disc became a little bit more bulged, and that was the ouch that you just experienced. But then beyond that, in the days, weeks, months, and sometimes longer than that you're constantly experiencing these fluctuations in pain, much of that is going to be down to inflammation congesting this area, creating a lot of pressure, leading you to want to do movements like the knee hugs and child's pose. And if we use contrast bathing, the alternating of hot and cold directly over the lumbar spine for around about 20 minutes, alternating 3 to 5 minutes of each, we can start to manage that excessive inflammation in that region and not allow the pressure to build up to levels that are causing us significant symptoms. If you want to learn a little bit more about contrast bathing and a really cool tool from Therabody, then you can check out the link down in the description to the Recovery Therm Cube review. We talk a little bit about it there, and I would strongly suggest it is a great device that you can use if you find contrast bathing helpful without the need to go back and forwards from the freezer to the microwave using a hot water bottle and frozen peas. To finish this little section off, we've got a little resource for you down in the description, which is a full follow-along routine to put all of these little bits that I've talked about together into something that you can follow along with live. And this is a version of the phase 1 routine that we have for our members in the program. And it's an absolutely great way of doing the stretching, doing the decompression, doing the contrast bathing on a regular basis and just following through. Understand that you need to be doing this stuff multiple times a day because it is not getting you stronger, but it is help managing the strain that's building up from daily life and the exercises on that herniated disc to provide it with that little bit of respite. And ideally, you continue to do this alongside the strengthening stuff, which we're going to cover next, for the long term, even if the pain's not there, because life puts load on our spines. And if we can do things a little bit better, just like the way we brush our teeth every day, even though we don't have cavities, the same thing can be said for this kind of back pain relief routine. Consider it a back hygiene routine, perhaps, something that is helping managing the health of your lumbar spine and its ability to deal with the cumulative stress and strain of everyday life. Now, before we get into this stability, please don't make the mistake of saying, I've got to leave this until I feel better. That's an error. The simple fact of the matter is, with these sorts of exercises, you're already doing things that are more strenuous than this every single day. And so starting to learn these from day one carefully is going to be the secret to success. Not only that, but it also makes you more effective at doing the things in the previous routine without aggravating your back. So like we said earlier, we can't control the individual segments of our lumbar spine, but what we can do very, very effectively when taught is engage the abdominal and trunk musculature to provide a support for the lumbar spine in its entirety, to brace this whole section here. And that is the stuff that we've got built in, but we're probably not using it very well. And so our stability exercises need to be focused on movements that do not move the spine. Instead, by engaging and bracing the trunk musculature. And the reason I say trunk is because too many people think core and they just think the abs, but actually it's deeper than that. It's a more holistic blend of musculature running the whole way around our midsection. And those muscles all work with the core muscles, the ab muscles, the transverse abdominis, the internal and external obliques. It works with those back muscles as well to provide that stability to the trunk, to prevent movement that we don't want. And don't get me wrong here, we're not going to be able to make the spine not move at all. But what we will do with good control and careful application of this engagement and bracing of the core is take the movement down by 95 to 99% on more or less all activities that we're doing when we brace effectively. The great thing about these stability-based exercises is that you've got a very clear line that you cross from doing it right to doing it wrong, especially in those of you that are more acute and in a lot more pain. For the more chronic among you, especially the guys, I find sometimes you guys can push ahead a little bit more when the choreography wasn't there because you're not quite as sensitized or sensitive to those movements from every day. But the simple thing here is if you did these movements and you got pain, you did it wrong. You didn't stabilize the spine. You allowed it to move, bend, twist in one way or another. So we go back, we reevaluate, we try again, maybe with an easier or harder version. And that's what I'm going to get onto next. We recently did a podcast called The Core 5 for Spine Health. And these were our selection of 5 exercises that every single person can do at some level. They're going to improve their health of their lumbar spine and the stability of that region. And these are the dead bug, the marching bridge, the squat, the hip hinge, and the step up. And make no mistake, many of you, as with many of our members and patients, have tried these exercises in the past, but the details make a massive difference. For example, sticking your bum out, tucking your bum in when you're doing a squat, bracing and engaging yourself correctly when you're doing a squat or a hip hinge, bracing and engaging yourself correctly when we're doing a dead bug or a marching bridge, doing pelvic tucks here and there. All of these sorts of things are incorrect in many different ways for many different reasons. And how we do these movements makes a massive difference to whether they are improving our spine stability or creating other problems that we just don't need to deal with. And with all of these exercises, there are full demonstrations, tutorials in other videos that we've got on the website and on the YouTube channel. So I'm not going to waste time going through those here. Otherwise the video will be terribly long. But what I will say about all of these exercises is for every single one, you can scale them down and make them easier and easier and easier to suit your current level. But more importantly, once you've done that, you can build them back up and up and up with the addition of weight, especially in the squat, the hip hinge, and the step up, to make sure that you are using them in the way which we'll discuss shortly to rebuild the integrity of those herniated discs. Now, ideally, when you're doing these, when you're troubleshooting, when you're figuring out which variation you can do, you're going to be aiming for something like 10 reps that do not aggravate your symptoms. And then you might build that out to something like 3, 4, or 5 sets of the 10 reps. Always looking for not aggravating the pain when we're doing these, because that indicates we didn't control our spine and therefore we're practicing something that is not going to serve us. Be strict on yourself. Don't go, it's kind of starting to hurt a little bit, I'll carry on. No, you failed. It notably changed from no discomfort to a little bit of discomfort. Stop, restart. Something went wrong. Ultimately, the great thing about those last couple of exercises, the squat and the hip hinge in particular, but also the step up to a lesser degree, is that as we scale those, increase the difficulty, add load, carefully, of course, in a controlled environment, we have an ability to literally make these discs stronger than they were before. And for all of us, apart from the elite level powerlifter, there is every reason why, or every chance that we can get to the point where we are stronger than we were before in our back. If you know for a fact right now today, you can't pick up a 5-kilo dumbbell or kettlebell and do 10 reps of a hip hinge or a squat without aggravating your back in a significant way, and in 6 weeks from now, you're doing 15 to 20 kilos, and then 6 weeks from then on, you're doing 30 to 40, there is no doubt at all that you have improved the integrity of your spine, that healing is taking place, that remodeling is taking place, and that strengthening of these very discs that have been damaged is starting to get well underway. We have objective proof in that scenario of the capacity of our spine to bear load, what it was compared to what it is. The thing is, that kind of result, although it's the result that all of you guys are looking for, is a result that takes time, effort, and energy, and it also requires a little bit of mistakes along the way. The good news is that when we're using that kind of approach in the gym or at home with verifiable weights, we have a good test, a good benchmark for what our current level of capacity is. So we know that I can do 10 reps of 5 kilos on my hip hinge, but my toddler weighs 15. So what do I do when I have to pick them up? Well, at least I know up here that it's a bit of a roll of the dice. I'm having to bend down lower and they weigh more than I'm used to in my rehab. But in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks time, when I'm now doing 30 to 40 kilos perhaps, now the toddler that weighs 15 is a much safer bet. Picking them up off the floor is going to be perceivably a lower strain activity relative to what it once was. And this is the additional benefit. Understanding in the controlled environment what you do and what you have capacity for helps you better understand what stresses and strains might push you over the edge. Sometimes you're going to make the bet. You're going to do it anyway. But at least you will be able to dispense with this feeling of having no idea why it flared your back up. You will know that you made the decision in the moment to push yourself more than you should have, and you will deal with the consequences, just like any other accident or fall. But you won't be stuck in this silly cycle of not knowing why your back pain's not getting better, not knowing why you keep flaring yourself up, and getting, quite frankly, rather depressed and gloomy about the outlook for the future. So we'll leave it there for today's video. Hopefully you found it helpful. Now, there are a bunch of different resources that we've got all over the place. We've got them on the YouTube channel, on the website. This was not supposed to be a video to go through all of these individual exercises because we've got those produced much better in other areas. So you can always check those out. But if you know someone else who's struggling with their herniated disc and they've not had a lot of luck in the past, consider sharing this video with them, because we need to understand what's going on if we're to have any hope of sticking to a plan to fix it for the long term. As always, if you did find it helpful, consider giving it a thumbs up. If there are any questions, you can post down in the comments, and we look forward to seeing you in another one. Thanks for watching.